So thank you very much, everyone, for signing in. This is the Civil War Study Group at Lake of the Woods. And hopefully you didn't see that. But at any rate, we have a great speaker today. But before we do that, I will go into the remind you that muting your mic and turning off your video ensures the best technical conditions for a presentation. One of the things I wanted to mention is that we have updated the Civil War Study Group website, and it is live now. And you'll notice by the images there that we have a separate layout for desktop and tablet and then for smartphones. So it's a lot easier for you to view the content on your smartphone. Although on the smartphone for some of the images, I do indicate that it's a good idea to hold it in landscape mode. But in any event, we're introducing the menu, little expanded menu thing here. When you click on that little stack of images, it brings up a menu that flies in from the right. And like all of these types of menus, there are some of the menu items, such as About here that you see, that has a downward facing caret. When you click on that, the submenu appears, as you see there: About Our Mission, About Board, About Annual Report, etc. And then there's Resources, etc. So it'll make your navigation through the website a lot easier. And I hope that you enjoy that. If you have any issues or any comments or any suggestions, please let us know. One of the things that I want to point out also is that next month we will have our first in-person meeting in many months. We have Patrick Schroeder, who's chief historian at the Appomattox National Military Park, and he'll be talking about the 146th New York's, I'm going to mispronounce that, Zouaves in Saunders Field. That middle picture there is a reenactment of at the 150th in 2014, and to the right is Ranger Schroeder in a Zouave uniform. So our topic today is 4 years a target, St. George's Church. Our speaker is Craig Rains. Craig, as you may know, is a founding member, or one might say a founding father of this study group organization, and also a past president 2014 to 2016, helping to lay a solid foundation for the years since. He spent 37 years in advertising and public relations, has a BSBA in marketing from the University of Arkansas, has an MA in journalism from University of Arkansas, Little Rock, where he was also an adjunct professor. He was a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army, was captain and a radio TV officer for the U.S. Army Reserve. He's also a past director and interpreter at Elwood Manor nearby, which is run by Friends of the Wilderness Battlefield. A member of Sons of the American Revolution, Sons of Confederate Veterans, Military Order of Stars and Bars. Very busy guy. He's also head of the docent program at Historic St. George's Episcopal Church in Fredericksburg, which has a 300th anniversary set of celebrations coming up, which I'm sure he'll mention. He's lived at Lake of the Woods he and his wife Carol since 2002, excuse me. I'm going to now stop sharing of my screen, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to Craig, and also mute myself. We will have a question and answer period at the end. The chat feature, as you've perhaps used in the past, is available, so you can type in a request at any time, but we won't address the questions until the end of the presentation. So at this point, I turn over to Craig. Go for it, Craig.
Charles,
All right.
this is Bob. Sorry to interrupt, but did you start recording?
Yes, I did, Bob.
All right, I think we're ready to go now. Thank you, Charles, and I appreciate that very much. When I got into this presentation, Charles had asked me to do a presentation on St. George's Church in the Civil War, because we are celebrating our 300th anniversary this year. But as I got into it, it became more than just the church. So what has transpired is that my topic has changed. 4 years at Target, St. George's Bell Tower and its intersection of Princess Anne and George Streets as ground zero in Civil War Fredericksburg. Now, standing as the tallest item around town is the St. George's steeple. And in this picture that I took from Chatham, you'll see in the middle of the screen is St. George's Tower. If you look all the way over to your right, you'll see the Baptist Church Tower. And then if you go past, come back to your left, there is a tower next to St. George's, and that's the old courthouse. And we do have now, since in the last few years, the new courthouse is built. It now has a tower on the far left. But for what purposes we're going to do, we're going to stick with the standing tallest one in 1862, and that is St. George's steeple and the intersection. Standing tallest may be great in basketball, but not so much in war. And this is the case of this steeple. It was the highest thing in 1862, and it became a focal point for a lot of people, which you'll find out today. So let's look at where it is in relation to the river and this downtown. It's on a site that was set aside for a church in 1720 or 1728 when Fredericksburg was founded and the city was laid out. They put aside 2 lots for a church and for a graveyard, and ended up with St. George's being the church that was built there. This is the way it looks today. And taking a good look, we will go from this look to this look. And if I can, I'm not sure whether my cursor will point it out, but the church in the middle is St. George's Church. Directly across the street from it, the little red brick building is known as the Farmers Bank of Fredericksburg. And next to it, in the building to the lower right, is the red brick, is the red topped Presbyterian church. And then across from it in the green topped building is the old courthouse. The Farmers Bank of Fredericksburg is this building that was built in, it's on the northwest corner, and it was built in 1820. It's where Foode is today. At the end of the Civil War, the bank failed because its assets consisted largely of Confederate notes. They were worthless. But what went on in this building during the Civil War is what we're going to talk about. You'll see on the left of this picture here, there's a side entrance to this building. And that was where the bank cashier lived. It was a residence, it was upstairs. And the cashier lived there with his wife and his wife's personal slave, who was a 10-year-old by the name of John Washington. John Washington lived there for the first 24 years of his life. And you're going to be hearing more about him later on. On the southwest corner is the Presbyterian Church. It was built in 1833. The minister, by the way, help, what's wrong here? Somebody wants in? Just a minute. The minister there was Beverly Tucker Lacey. Now, some of you may remember Beverly Tucker Lacey. He would become chaplain to General Stonewall Jackson. And in 1863, it was Lacey who took Jackson's amputated arm to Elwood Manor, the home of his brother, J. Horace Lacey, to be buried in the family cemetery, where it remains today. And that is the marker for the arm at Elwood. Now, going back to the columns in front of the Presbyterian church, you'll see a couple of cannonballs in this column. That's what these black things are. There's one there, there's one behind the light. They have their own story. In the actual battle, the column had 2 cannonballs hit it and bounce off, and it left indentations. Well, the 2 balls that you see there today, they're not from the Battle of Fredericksburg. They were actually installed in 1889. They were taken from a pile of cannonballs at Hunter's Foundry, which had gathered them up to be melted down into farm implements. And so the congregation decided that they wanted their own Civil War history. And in 1889, they put that up. Now, on the southeast corner of Princess Anne and George is the Fredericksburg Corporation Courthouse. And it's got a very nice courtyard that's all put together in 1852. You got to give me a little wiggle room here because the building is not actually on the corner, but its courtyard is on the corner. So I consider it on the corner for this story, for this presentation. And then the 4th corner is the northeast corner of St. George's Church with its green bell tower that was the highest point in town. The building was completed in 1849. In 1854, the city council voted to pay for clocks to be installed in the bell tower for the convenience of the townspeople. The council also agreed to pay $20 a year for annual maintenance. This arrangement continues to this day, and it's an unusual joining of church and state. The intersection, the 4 buildings, this is the only intersection in Fredericksburg that has all 4 buildings on all 4 corners placed on the National Register of Historic Places by the Department of the Interior. And actually, St. George's will officially mount its plaque in ceremonies. It'll be at 11 o'clock a week from Saturday with a civil ceremony on that. Now, let's begin in 1862. In the spring of 1862, the Confederate Army was around, but they pulled out and went south to keep the Army of the Potomac from attacking Richmond. And that left Fredericksburg exposed to any military incursions from the north. Well, on March the 22nd, Confederate President Jefferson Davis came to town to get a firsthand view of how the town could defend itself if the North came down and attacked. He took a look, he rode through the city, and his comment was, "Your town of Fredericksburg is right in the wrong place." Wow. So it is said that from the Fredericksburg Bank had a museum, and in the museum, it talked about the fact that Davis came out of the bank, stood on the front steps, and gave a talk to a large crowd. 3 weeks later, the Union troops arrived across the river, and it created quite a panic among the town people, and they all began to leave. At the time, I mentioned John Washington, that was a 10-year-old slave. Well, by now, he had grown up, and he was a bartender at the Shakespeare Hotel on Caroline Street. The hotel owners panicked, and they rushed to leave town, and on their way out, they gave John Washington the keys to the hotel, and they thrust a roll of banknotes in his hand as he wrote, And he said, they hurriedly told me to pay off all the servants and shut up the house and take charge of everything. Well, after the owners left, Washington poured drinks for the hotel's slave laborers, and they all toasted to the Yankees' health. On the way back to his room, he ran into his owner, Catherine Tolliver, who said, "Hurry, John, you must flee south before the Yankees come over." He replied, "Yes, ma'am." But after she had left, rather than turn south, John turned north. And on that Good Friday, he crossed the river to the Union lines and into freedom. A few weeks later, a Union colonel attended the services at St. George's, and he reported that the rector, Alfred Randolph, had omitted the usual Episcopal prayer for the President of the United States. However, he did say that he did not pray for the President of the Confederacy either, but he attributed this to the federal officers being in the congregation. Across the intersection, the Presbyterian congregation had reserved side pews for the Union members. Church member Jane Beale wrote in her diary, "The church is so full of federal soldiers that I thought at first the trial would be too great for me to bear. But their deportment was quiet and reverential, and I almost forgot they were our enemies." Well, over on Stafford Heights, John Washington, Mrs. Tolliver's now ex-slave, was hired to work for Union General Rufus King, and he was earning a salary of $18 a month. 5 days after John had fled Fredericksburg on May the 23rd, President Abraham Lincoln came to town. He visited the Union headquarters at Chatham, and then he and the Secretary of War, Stanton, came into Fredericksburg, and they stopped at, yes, the Farmers' Bank. That was the headquarters of General Marcina Patrick, the provost and the military governor of Fredericksburg. General Patrick wrote that they stayed about 30 minutes, and then Lincoln walked out on the front steps, where Jefferson Davis had been only months or weeks before, and he made a brief speech on the Princess Anne Street steps, which is now the main entrance to Foode. John Tackett Gilrick, a teenager, recalled hearing the president, and he wrote sometime later, "President Lincoln from the front steps made a short but splendid address. The writer of this," meaning himself, "sat on the steps of the St. George's Church on the opposite side of the street and heard President Lincoln's speech." Years later, Gilrick would preside as a judge in the corporation courthouse to his left as he sat that day, and you can see the courthouse there in the background. Gilrick was familiar with St. George's too. In fact, his family paid $275 a year to rent pew number 95 in the nave, which is the second one from the front. So when he was young, he had to behave himself. Well, Gilrick joined the Fredericksburg Artillery, but a year after he joined was Appomattox, and he surrendered, was paroled, and he walked home. But now, John Gilrick was very proud of the time that he served with the Southern Army. But the interesting thing is that he used his influence as a judge to advance the cause of reconciliation between the North and the South. He gave speeches on Memorial Days about the valor and sacrifices of both sides. He gave speeches at dedication ceremonies for 9 Civil War monuments, including the Andrew Humphreys Monument in the Fredericksburg National Cemetery and the 5th Corps Monument. When President Warren G. Harding visited the Wilderness Battlefield to review the Marine Corps troops in 1921, Judge Gilrick donned what looks to me like his Confederate Veterans Reunion uniform to greet the president. Well, John Washington appears again in the scene in spring of 1862. General King moved his headquarters into Fredericksburg at where else but the Farmers' Bank, probably at the suggestion of John Washington. Earlier, the Confederate authorities had sent to Libby Prison in Richmond 4 highly respected local men who refused to renounce their allegiance to the United States. On July 29th, John Washington gave Union officers the names of several prominent secessionists in Fredericksburg. 19 of them were rounded up and arrested, including Mayor Montgomery Slaughter. They were held as hostages in the Farmers' Bank before being moved to the old Capitol prison in Washington, D.C. And sure enough, within a couple of months, the federal retaliation worked and all the hostages were exchanged. Well, we'll leave John Washington. Here he is in later life. And we'll leave him in his upstairs room at the Farmers' Bank. After the war, he moved to Washington. He was a successful painter. In 1873, he wrote Memories of the Past, which is a manuscript that told his whole life. And it's studied by scholars today. Well, as the war progressed, the defeats in the summer resulted in the Union Army withdrawing again to Washington. But after Antietam in the fall, Lee's forces moved back into central Virginia. In November of 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia marched into town, and the Federals began moving down toward Stafford County, and they were to arrive on November the 17th. The Confederates warned the townspeople to leave and issued an order for the civilians to leave by 5 o'clock the next morning. This is 303 Hanover, the half of the building that's on the left. It was the home of St. George's rector, Reverend Randolph. He got the word at midnight. He arranged for the Confederate Army to provide an ambulance to carry his wife and their 1-day-old child from their home here through the Confederate lines to safety. Dr. James Cook, a St. George's vestryman, in the rush to leave town, went to the church and got some of its historical records to take in case of the battle. He took them to a friend who owned Purcell and Ladd's store in downtown Richmond and asked him to keep them there until the war was over. On November 27th, Captain James Powers Smith, one of Stonewall Jackson's aides, wrote in his diary about his and Jackson's being at the intersection of George and Princess Anne Streets. He wrote, although it was Sunday morning, no church bells were ringing, and the streets were almost deserted, as were the homes. We sat in our saddles at the corner of the bank and the churches. Mrs. Vivian Minor Fleming published Smith's notes, and she went on to say, General Jackson, she wrote, quote, dismounted from his horse on the corner of George and Princess Anne Streets, and he stood for a long time, plunged in deep thought. Captain Smith asked permission to go and water his horse at the river. The general replied, no, Captain, some of those people might get you. But Smith said he did anyway. General Lee joined Jackson at the intersection and discussed what might happen should the Federals cross the river. There's a plaque on the brick wall at the Presbyterian church that reads, General Stonewall Jackson, by General Lee's request, on this corner, planned the Battle of Fredericksburg, November 27, 1862. As the day of battle drew nearer, the Federal artillery batteries prepared to rain terror on the city. St. George's towering green steeple was the highest point in town, and the one in which several cannons were aiming for target practice. One Union artillerist wrote, quote, an officer of another battery remarked that the first shot he put into the city should pass through the clock in St. George's steeple. In fact, he proposed to breach the wall in such a way that the clock would fall into the body of the church. He explained that he felt impelled to this act through a sense of predestined responsibility. Well, the guns opened up upon the city, he wrote, with a murderous, deafening roar. Remembering the threat against the tower and the clock, I watched through a glass for their destruction, but the hands still moved on. Later, Asking my friend why he'd failed in his threatened demolition, he replied, he was watching the first shot he fired at it flying, as he thought, straight for the mark, but that before reaching the dial, the shell visibly swerved to the right and only clipped the corner of the tower. He said he experienced such a change of feeling that nothing could have induced him to harm it. Maybe divine intervention. After the war, Union Captain William Bartlett wrote, "On the night of the bombardment, the tall spire loomed like a specter to the soldiers. Regularly from the belfry came the solemn record of the hour resounding among the hills. Despite the tower and the building being struck by more than 25 cannonballs, the clock survived 3 days of battle," he said. The federal forces finally crossed the Rappahannock River on their pontoon bridges, and they started up the hill, some of them up George to the intersection of the Princess Anne. But Mississippi sharpshooters took up positions in the lower level of St. George's, which is shown here, and they fired out the windows, effectively shutting down the Union advance. They broke out many of the diamond-shaped windows to clear their lines of sight. But some of the original windows survived, and you can see them today, and they're the ones that have kind of wavy lines in them. Later in the day, the Confederates began slowly to withdraw south toward the heights. Unfortunately, the Army of the Potomac had no immediate plan of action, and the soldiers were left in an almost deserted city, looting throughout the day and into December 12th, until the order was restored at the direction of General Patrick. Betty Herndon Maury writes in her diary of seeing 2 Union soldiers tied back to back in a tree in front of the corporation courthouse, and above them was a sign reading, quote, "For entering private houses without orders," close quotes. Across the river at the Lacey House, which is now the Chatham, a hospital had been set up. One aid worker there was Clara Barton, volunteer from Washington. Late in the day, she received a note from J. Clarence Cutter, a surgeon with the 21st Massachusetts, who had crossed into the city. It read, "Your place is here." She left immediately and joined him. The Presbyterian church became a hospital, and it became Clara Barton's headquarters, from which she assisted throughout the area around the intersection. Across the street at St. George's, a strange thing was taking place as the looting soldiers wandered through town. Washington Wright, a free black who was the church sexton, saw 4 Union soldiers at the altar. He realized they were not there for prayers, but they had found the hidden 4 pieces of the church's engraved silver communion set, and they were stealing them. The set consisted of a flagon, which is the pitcher, 2 chalices or cups, and a paten or a communion plate. Wright chased one soldier and tackled him in the intersection and retrieved a chalice. The other 3 soldiers ran away with their booty. On December 13th, the federal order was given to attack the Confederate position at the Sunken Road. In the old courthouse cupola, the Federals set up a signal station and an observation point. From here, the Union General Darius Couch watched as waves and waves of soldiers unsuccessfully attempted to assault the Confederates on the Sunken Road. He was reported to have exclaimed, "Oh, great God, see how our men, our poor fellows, are falling." Another officer in the cupola was Union General O.O. Howard. After the war, he would head the Freeman's Bureau, which had its headquarters across the street at the Farmers Bank building. The battle raged and wounded soldiers streamed back into town, including down George Street. Clara Barton worked alongside Dr. Cutter, and she would later write, "The surgeons do all they can, but no provision has been made for such a wholesale slaughter. And I believe it would be impossible to comprehend the magnitude without witnessing it." Well, General Butler gave the order to withdraw from Fredericksburg. In the retreat, Lieutenant Frederick Hitchcock of the 132nd Pennsylvania spotted another soldier, a scamp he called him, carrying off St. George's silver flagon. Hitchcock wrote, "Our chaplain took it from him and strapped it to his saddlebag to preserve it for its owner if the time should come that it could be returned." Union Captain William Bartlett wrote, "On the night of December 14th, as the federal troops retreated back across the river under an injunction of silence, they suddenly heard the sound of the clock of the church ringing out the hour of 2, ringing out as though exulting with the victors, while the distant hills echoed back in solemn requiem." The Army moved across the river, and Clara Barton went with it, returning to the Lacey House, and she remained there until all the patients went north. And then she finally headed home in December, the end of December. In 1863, the Confederates were back and occupied Fredericksburg. St. George's Reverend Randolph was in town, and he wrote his family about Confederate bodyguards. Things are made worse by Confederate bodyguards. And if you don't know what that is, that's lice. They muster here in strong force and threaten to walk off with the town. Our people do not attend services with soldiers for fear of becoming breeding grounds themselves. Just before the Battle of Chancellorsville, there was a private named Westwood Todd of the 12th Virginia Infantry. He recalled that General William Mahone, quote, "directed me to go up to the highest church steeple in town and from the belfry to observe and report any important movements of the enemy's camp across the river. The duty was pleasant at first, but became irksome after the novelty wore off." Well, bored, Westwood dozed off. Confederate pickets were in the meantime ordered to leave the rifle pits and silently withdraw back to the sunken road. He continued writing, "I was in the church steeple and had been forgotten. When I came down at night and went to my old position, I found that my whole company was gone. I was holding the town all by myself." Later in 1863, morale was on the upswing in the South. There had been a victory at Chancellorsville, and there was a great religious revival sweeping through Lee's army in Fredericksburg. Church services began at the Presbyterian church, and they were held 3 times a day. Then when the crowds became too large, the revival was moved to the Baptist church, the Methodist church, and then to the Baptist church. And finally, it came to St. George's, the largest sanctuary in town. One minister wrote, "The spacious Episcopal church was filled, nay, packed, long before the ultimate hour to its utmost capacity. The lower floor, the galleries, the aisles, the chancel, the pulpit steps, the vestibule, while hundreds were turned away disappointed." William Jones, in his book, Christ in the Camp, wrote about one revival meeting at St. George's. He said, "We had a Presbyterian sermon introduced by Baptist services under the direction of a Methodist chaplain in an Episcopal church. Was that not a beautiful solution of the vexed problem of Christian union?" In 1864, in the spring of 1864, the Union Army of the Potomac met the Army of Northern Virginia in an unlikely and unliked place, the Wilderness. Both sides were caught off guard at the location. In only 3 days, there were more than 27,000 casualties, men killed, wounded, or missing. There was no place to tend the thousands of wounded for the Union Army in the Wilderness. So it was decided to send them to Fredericksburg. Clara Barton would return to Fredericksburg again to face the nightmare of more wounded as they poured into town from the battles of Wilderness and the Spotsylvania Courthouse. Injured soldiers piled up everywhere in town. The old courthouse became a hospital with its main courtroom turned into an operating room. Again, one Union soldier wrote, "Every foot of space was appropriated for the wounded." Death was ever present to claim its victims. These were carried out just beyond the building, where grave diggers could be seen through the windows, constantly at their gruesome task. St. George's also became one of its main hospitals. Thomas Walker Gilmer, a Fredericksburg lawyer, wrote, "The terrible fighting at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse have brought thousands of federal wounded to the place. The churches were occupied as houses, as hospitals, and the ruin commenced by the shelling was now complete. From all but one church, the pews were removed with all their furniture. So the soldiers were told to clear the churches to make room for the incoming wounded. A Pennsylvania regimental band was recruited to clear the Baptist church shown here. And they did so by throwing the pews out the windows. The one church that Thomas Gilmer said still had its pews was St. George's. Its pews were bolted to the floor, so they stayed. Downstairs at St. George's was a surgeon room. Major St. Clair Mulholland of the 116th Pennsylvania Regiment later described the scene. He said, "In the lecture room of the Episcopal Church, 8 operating tables were in full blast. The floor was densely packed with men whose limbs were crushed, fractured, torn. They waited very patiently. There was no grumbling, no screaming. Many of the badly hurt were smiling and chatting. And one who had both legs shot off was cracking jokes with an officer who could not laugh at the humorous sallies, for his lower jaw was shot away. Hands and feet, arms and legs were thrown under each table, and the sickening piles grew larger as the night progressed. Towards morning, the conversation flagged. Many dropped off to sleep before they could be attended to, and many of them never woke again." After treatment downstairs, the injured were carried up the side of the church, up George Street, into the front door. The wounded filled all the pews, but still they came. So they were placed on the floors under the pews, and they continued to come. At that point, the hospital stewards went out into the neighborhood and pulled sideboards off of the homes and brought them back and laid them crossways over the tops of the pews to provide a third layer of wounded troops. An official of the United States Christian Commission recorded his observations, published in 1869. Quote, "In the Episcopal Church, a nurse is motoring up a wounded officer in the area behind the altar. 2 candles in the spacious building throw their feeble rays in the dark. There's a heavy, stifled breathing as a constant effort to suppress involuntary cries. A wounded New Hampshire soldier wrote at St. George's, he saw dead soldiers piled on either side of the entrance as high as the top step, and the fence hanging full of belts, cartridge boxes, canteens, and haversacks. The dead were hastily buried. Some who died at St. George's were buried in its graveyard to eventually be reburied at the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. To this day, the pews at St. George's, which are the original ones on which the wounded lay, remind us of the horrors of war. On May 27th, the last Union hospitals in Fredericksburg disbanded, and Fredericksburg was left by itself until in May 1865, when the victorious Union armies would march through town on their way to Washington. Time out. One month after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the women of the Presbyterian Church formed the South's First Ladies Memorial Association. They purchased land for the Confederate cemetery at the end of Amelia Street. On Sunday, April the 2nd, with Grant closing in on Lee at Petersburg, the Confederates abandoned Richmond with orders to burn the bridges, the armory, and the supply warehouses as they left. Well, the fire spread quickly, and several blocks of the downtown district also burned, including Purcell and Ladd's store, where the church's only copy of its records from 1817 to 1862 had been carefully restored. Now, I mentioned the Presbyterian Church, the Ladies Memorial Association, and they purchased land for the Confederate cemetery at the end of Amelia Street, where 3,533 Confederate dead were reinterred. And the association, Ladies Association, continues to maintain that cemetery today. Shortly after the war ended, the new rector of St. George's was sent north to raise funds to restore the damaged church. The Church Journal, an Episcopal publication in New York City, had a favorable article that read, "The Reverend Maury is among us for the purpose of raising a moderate amount to aid in putting the parish church of St. George, Fredericksburg, in decent repair. Because of the damages of the war, the building cannot be occupied in rainy weather at all, nor in winter." And then, as if to reassure its readers, they went on to say, "We hardly need to say, for that will be understood as a matter of course, that the prayer for the President of the United States has been used at St. George's ever since the permanent occupation of the city by the United States forces made it safe." The Bishop of New York helped Maury raise more than $1,400. By fall, the old courthouse was used as the Freedman's Court, where cases were brought by Black citizens every Friday. In 1866, a year after the war ended, St. George's received a package in the mail with a return address of the New York City Police Department. Inside was the communion service flagon that was taken on December 12th. There was no name or note accompanying it. It just arrived. The second piece of the communion service had come home. In 1869, after the war, Robert E. Lee had become president of Washington College in Lexington. And in 69, he was his church's delegate to the diocesan convention, which was being held at St. George's. One morning when the delegates were downstairs eating breakfast, young Miss Clara Boggs, the daughter of another lay delegate, approached Lee and expressed her admiration for him. She then asked if she could have a snip of his hair. To the laughter of those seated around him, he agreed. She pulled her sewing scissors from her handbag and cut off a lock of his hair. Later in 1869, it was discovered that a silver plate was on display as a war souvenir by someone living in Albany, New York. It turned out to be the St. George's paten. And you can see the inscription sort of around the edges. After heavy political pressure and threats of exposing him in the media, he returned the plate. So 3 of the 4 pieces had been united. In 1870, the Presbyterian Church received a new bell to replace the one melted down for the Confederacy in the war effort in 1862. And Clara Barton, who served out of the Presbyterian Church during the war, afterwards she worked for years to create the American Red Cross and was finally successful in 1881. In 1962, the Civil War Centennial Committee of Fredericksburg erected this historical marker at the Presbyterian Church. It reads, "Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, a devoted nurse and tireless organizer who knew no enemy but the unfeeling heart. We walked the way she took in easing the suffering at the Battle of Fredericksburg when the churches became military hospitals. Well, 1887, St. George's was not yet through with the war. St. George's filed a claim with the US government for $2,487 for compensation for war damages. Well, of course, nothing happened. 1905. In 1905, St. George's filed for its $2,487 with the US Court of Claims because the federal government had not responded since 1887, 40 years after the war's end. Well, the Court of Claims finally awarded St. George's the sum of $900 in payment for the rent and repairs as the church as a federal hospital. But did they get the check? Well, the check finally arrived in 1916, 50 years after the end of the war. But it was only for $810. With that money, the church installed electric lights in the chancel. They bought a $200 piano and made other repairs. There was enough money remaining to pay the attorney fees for the drawn-out lawsuit, $135.50. We cannot leave the St. George's Silver Communion service incomplete. In 1931, Ms. Lillian Thayer of Williston, Mass., the daughter of a Union Civil War veteran, wrote to St. George's that she had a cup inscribed with St. George's name, and she thought the church might be interested in buying it from her. She offered to sell it for $80. St. George's rector wrote back sternly, "The Holy Communion service, which this cup was a part of, was stolen by federal soldiers. It's still the property of the church." And he countered an offer of $50. Ms. Thayer reluctantly agreed and mailed the cup to the church. The Freelance Star trumpeted this news with the headline, "Old Communion set taken in war, finally restored." Thus, after 69 years after they were stolen, the communion set came together again. The cup that was tackled at the intersection of George and Princess Anne, the flagon that the chaplain retrieved during the Union retreat, the plate that was discovered in the politician's home in New York, and the cup that Ms. Thayer returned. They were once together all again, and they are used today every Sunday in the church. I'll close with this painting of Mort Kunstler. It's called "Changing the Pickets," and it was supposed to be his interpretation of December the 2nd, 1862. He did research and found out that sure enough, it snowed that day. This is sundown at 4:54 in the afternoon. The scene is the Farmers Bank building. And to the right, you see the Presbyterian church. And behind it, you see the old courthouse. And off to the left is St. George's Church with its bell tower and its clock. So the next time you cross the intersection of Princess Anne and George Streets, look around and imagine all that took place there over 4 years of the war and after. It's as good a place as any to be considered ground zero, if not a key focal point in the Civil War in Fredericksburg. Charles?
Very good, Craig. Thank you so much.
I guess I'll
please-
give it back to
Yeah, right. So are there any questions, please? You need to unmute yourself or else use the chat feature. Oh, okay. So Bob Johnson says we've taken the trolley tour several times, and I would swear they say the cannonballs were part of the battle. Ah, well.
Everything you read says that, but I have found proof that they were installed in 1889, and the church will tell you that.
Okay. Any other questions, please? You can unmute yourself or else.
Are there any indication of the names of doctors that may have been involved with the hospitals, and were all the hospitals union hospitals?
The names of the doctors, if they were assigned to military units, yes, they are available. I had an uncle who was a hospital steward, and he recorded a list of all the doctors that he served under. All the hospitals were not Union hospitals. They were Confederate hospitals as well. But it was depending on who was in town at the time, either Confederates or the Federals. And poor Fredericksburg bounced back and forth between those two forces throughout the first part of the war.
I ask because I have the honor of working with Bob Epp on a project over at Elwood, where we're trying to identify doctors who may have been in the area and worked with the injured soldiers or whatever, in view of our room that Bob and Bob created.
Yeah, that's an excellent room. That you guys are doing a great job with that. Carolyn Elsner, in her book Dear Old Elwood, records the operation on General Jackson's arm, the amputation, which my uncle participated in as a hospital steward. And in it, she lists 4 doctors that we know that were there in the hospital there at the Wilderness Tavern. And I have not seen any research that tells which of those actually walked over to Elwood to deal with the injured over there. That was kind of a recuperating hospital.
I'm specifically assigned to a doctor by the name of Amos, Dr. Thomas Amos, AMISS. We have indication in various ways that he may have been there, but I can't quite zero in on getting him right where I need him to be.
Oh, I can understand that. That's a challenge.
There you go.
Very good. Well, any other questions? I see some activity on.
Yep. You want me my face here?
Oh,
I was wondering too. You said that after the war, the courthouse was used as a hearing location for Freeman's issues.
Yes.
Freeman issues. Do you know if there are records still in existence and where they might be of any of those proceedings?
I would be pretty sure that they are in the courthouse records. They set aside Fridays for Black residents who had their own issues, were suing somebody or so forth. And that was different from the Freedmen's Bureau. That was actually court proceedings. The Freedmen's Bureau was operating out of the Farmers Bank. And those records, I do not know where those records would be.
well, you know, another
Thank you.
place in this area that has a very good interpretive room in that regard is the Exchange Hotel. They have an entire room that is plastered all around the walls with the results of adjudication of the freedmen's complaints against their employers or whatnot.
Are you talking about in Gordonsville?
Yeah, in Gordonsville, yes.
Right.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, last call for questions. I want to thank you very much, Craig, for this.
I just want to thank Craig for an outstanding presentation.
Yes, indeed.
Not only did he educate us on a lot of facts that most of us didn't really know about, but the visuals and the pictures, et cetera, that you had, Craig, were outstanding. You put together an excellent presentation, I thought.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Well, all right. This recording will be made available sometime later today. And I thank you all for participating. And please remember that May 21st will be in person at the clubhouse. So we'll send out a notice about that in the next few weeks. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a very nice day. And I appreciate your participation. Take care.